Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our July 3rd edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode will prepare farmers for discussions they'll be having with landlords in the coming weeks and months. We'll start with Dr. Wendong Zhang, a former Iowa State University and current Cornell University economics professor who has conducted ISU's last two Iowa farmland ownership surveys, including the 2022 edition that was just released last month. So Dr. Zhang is going to give us the lay of the land when it comes to Iowa's current farmland ownership. Then we'll bring on Erin Herbold-Swalwell, a Farm Bureau attorney who formerly worked with Iowa State University's Center for Agricultural Law and Taxation, so she has extensive experience in the areas of farmland lease agreements and the relationships between farm landlords and tenants. Let's start with Dr. Wendong Zhang, who offered spokesman reporter Bob Bion some high-level insights into Iowa's farmland ownership late last month.
Wendong, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about the Farmland Ownership Survey's roots, where it came from, and why it's done?
I had the pleasure to conduct the 2017 and 2022 Iowa Farmland Ownership and Tenure Survey. This is a very unique survey and one of its kind in the nation. The survey about Iowa farmland ownership actually dates back to 1940s, but it's really become institutionalized essentially after the 1980 farm crisis, late 80s, that Iowa Code passed a legislative mandate to direct the Iowa State University to conduct the survey every 5 years. And so the value of the survey is not only we can provide the most current information as of 2022, but we can actually go back and provide perspective since 1982 for every 5 years.
So what types of information are we hoping to learn from the survey every 5 years?
Right. So this is a survey that essentially it's very different from some other surveys that if you're familiar with the U.S. agricultural census, and the census is a survey of agricultural producers. That we go out and essentially survey producers and tenants and who are actually farm operators. And this is a survey of people that is behind the scene and sometimes don't necessarily live in Iowa. They're the landowners. And so the survey essentially provide statistically representative information about who owns the land and how they own Iowa farmland, and do they lease out the land? If they do they lease out through cash rent versus crop share? Do they have farming experience? Who are the landowners? And why do they own Iowa farmland? And what their plans for land transfer when they no longer hold the farmland. And we added new questions about conservation practices and carbon credits. We also added new questions about beginning farmers. This is probably the only statistically representative survey that is done by extension. I have also led the Iowa Land Value Survey, and that's sort of an ad hoc survey of agricultural professionals. We cannot say a whole lot about sub-county or subgroup statistics, but this ownership survey is a survey that has that statistical rigor that we can say a lot about in terms of conservation practices or ownership practices, how this is used in terms of percent of land in Iowa and also percent of farmland owners.
What stood out to you most about Iowa's land ownership with this survey? What are the trends that we're seeing?
Right. There are several of interesting trends. One of the biggest trend is that the landowner continued to age, and there's a substantial increase in the share of the land owned by landowner who are 65 or older. And if you're thinking about how much land they own, that they used to own less than 30% of the Iowa farmland. And now that percent in 2022 owned by people who are 65 years old or above stood at 2/3. So this jump from 30% to 2/3. And If you're looking at the landowners who are 75 or above, they own 37% of the farmland. And this is a continuation of trend that when you're looking at the average age of landowners, we're probably talking about range around maybe 68 to 70 years old. It's not unique to landowners. The ag census also shows that ag producers, the operators, the average age is close to 58 to 60 years old. So they're aging as well. Agricultural labor workforce in the US as well. But this does come with several interesting implications where when you are thinking about who is your landowners if you're leasing land, they tends to be falling into the senior land categories. It's also potentially different because when you go to the landowner who are 75 or older, many of them may not currently farm, that we actually find 55% of the Iowa farmland is owned by someone who currently do not farm. And out of those non-operating landowners, half of them do not have farming experience. So if you are a tenant and you're talking with your landowner, you really need to do your homework and learn a little bit more about who your landowner is. And they may not actually know a whole lot about the agricultural production practices or conservation because they may not have the farming experience as the operator.
Could you address the fact that 84% of the land is free of debt?
So that's a very interesting statistics, and that is also tied with the aging landowner trends that we described earlier as well. So essentially that what we find is in 2022, 84% of the land in Iowa is owned free of debt. So how we arrive at this statistics is that suppose you are one of the landowner we interview through telephone, then I would ask you how many acres you own. Suppose you own like 500 acres. The interviewer essentially will follow up and talk about that out of the 500 acres, how many acres you own currently doesn't have any debt. How many acres you own are still having a mortgage on it, and how many acres that you are still purchasing under some contracts. I can calculate out of the 500 acres you own, what is the percent of the land that is owned free of debt. And what we find that statistics is at a staggering high number of 84%. That's the record high. And that statistics was 81 to 82% 5 years ago. And in 1980s, it's only 60%. Right? So there's substantial increase in the land that is owned debt-free. And that means when we are now facing rising interest rate, and these doesn't necessarily trickle down to land values as quickly as we think, because when you are thinking about the land purchases, a lot of the land, 2/3 of the land are owned by landowners who are 65 or older. And among those senior landowners, over 90% of the land they own are debt-free. And so when you are thinking about what means for the land supply, for one, that they don't necessarily need to hold the land for current income, and they are not nearly as impacted by mortgage rates. And when they get higher income through higher commodity prices or higher government payments, as we see following COVID, and they no longer necessarily need to pay back the loans. So what they do is often they have the resources to potentially invest that into new land purchases, especially when the land prices are really hitting really high prices in the auctions, close to $20,000 or beyond $20,000. You still see some farmers would pay essentially cash to buy these parcels as well. And that's tied with a really high share of the land that is owned free of debt. And that also means that when we are looking forward, that we are still probably in a limited land supply situation. The agricultural professional forecasted there might be a modest decline in land market, in land values in the following 6 to 18 months. Due to lower commodity prices and lower government payments, we don't necessarily see a dramatic correction in the land market. We're talking about maybe 5% decline over the next like a year or so.
It also looks like a move towards increased cash rent leasing of farmland. Could you address that a little bit?
That's another thing that is very interesting. What we've seen is there's a record high amount of the land that is leased out. So when you're looking at in 2022, essentially 58% of the land in Iowa are leased out. And how they leased out the land is primarily through cash rental arrangements and often through fixed cash rent. And so if we further drill down the three common ways of leasing arrangements, the fixed cash rent is probably a dominant way. It's accounting for 3/4 of the case, and then followed by flexible cash rent. And then like the crop share used to be way more prevalent in the 80s and 90s and are falling to the third. So essentially that you can think of this as a fixed cash rent plus some wiggle room of potential bonuses when your tenants are making a lot more money. There might be some wiggle room to decrease the rent when there's a natural disaster, a yield loss of some sort. The leased out situation is also tied with aging landowners, as I mentioned, that the 2/3 of the land overall in Iowa are owned by landowners who are 65 or older. And the senior landowners represents 8 out of the 10 cases when you're talking about landowner who lease out land. So when you are dealing with landowner who lease out land, there tends to be at a higher age as well. This year, we also find there's 20% of the land is owned by someone who is not an Iowa resident, which rose significantly from 2017. In 2017, that percent was 13, 14%. And among the non-resident landowners, and 70% of them do not have farming experience, and a lot of them would rent out land. Right? So there's multiple forces pushing for the rent. We have recently published papers to try to understand why people are pushing for fixed cash rent. Essentially, we find, if you're familiar with the Iowa geography, for the land, the higher quality land in the Des Moines Loeb area was higher quality, more consistent ground, that those are the crop heavy area, that those area tends to have a higher proportion of the land being rented out. Why? It's because for those parcels, it's relatively uniform in terms of the land quality. There's not a whole lot of variation. And so it's relatively easy to figure out how much you should expect in terms of agricultural production, crop yields, and also make it easier to calculate what the expected cash rent would be. So that tends to be rented out a lot more. And in contrast, if you're talking about southern Iowa with more recreational grounds, or in northeast Iowa, where there's a lot more dairy producers and the proportion of the owner operation is much higher. So even within Iowa, there's a regional variation in how people do this as well. We also find that if you have a parcel that has some variability, seasonal variability, that may have a pothole that would work well during a dry year, but would flood during wet year, then in these cases, with more variability in the land parcel, the landowner tends to be owner operating those and leveraging the private knowledge of the parcels themselves as well, as opposed to rented out.
So you've mentioned that Iowa's farmland owners are aging. How the ownership of Iowa's farmland is being held is also changing, moving more towards trusts. Would you mind addressing that and maybe some reasons why?
Right. So I think that over time that we have seen a significant shift away from the sole ownership or individual ownership or joint tenancy. So it's often husband and wife. And to a similar degree that tenants in common, you can think of this as, brother and sisters, shifting away from these ownership towards more institutionalized ownership in a form of land trust, corporations, or LLC. So if you think about the statistics, in 1982, close to 2/3 of the land in Iowa are owned in the form of sole owners or joint tenants or tenants in common. and their share essentially dropped to only half of what they had before. So only a third of the land are still owned that way. And so the growth essentially are shifted to land trust corporations and LLC. When you talk about land trust, 2/3 of the land trust are often revocable land trust. So what drove that? And there are a couple reasons. One, the aging of the landowners is corresponding to those. And over time, there's when the generational transfer occurs, when the land could be owned by grandpa alone or grandpa and grandma and pass on to the next generation. When you have like a more potential landowners who could have ownership rights, it's easy for them to have a more equal distribution when you have a more institutionalized structure. Especially back in the day, that the Iowa legislature don't allow like a partition in pieces, that if you want to divide up the land parcels, I cannot say that I will take this 40 acre or you will take the other 40 acre. The courts tends to force you to sell the pieces into and divide the money instead, right? But if you create the institutional ownership, and then you can take the shares from these corporations. So that's some of the reasons. And there are some other reasons where the land trust give you some more protection of privacy, that you can set up this for agriculture land trust or agriculture forever land trust or something like that, that you retain your privacy in your landowners, especially for people who live now out of the states. This could be attractive. And this also gives you a separation of the ownership assets with your personal assets as well. There are some other reasons where when the land values are rising significantly, that the assets value have grown significantly, that a lot of people are worried about how this will have capital gains and estate tax implications. And these complex ownership structure offer you some value discounts that these are essentially some restrictions on the ownership rights, which give you some evaluation discounts so that you can lower your tax burden potentially when assessing capital gains and estate tax burdens, right? So if you're looking at the regional variations in Western, Central, and Southwest, closer to the Omaha area, there's a lot more land trust compared to other places as well. So I think that over time, that when you have more people who are aging and thinking about how this will impacting my estate tax or capital gains tax implications, and when you have more people who are no longer necessarily living in Iowa, when you have more owners who don't necessarily understand agriculture as much as before, who do not currently farm, and these institutional structure is something that they often will opt in as opposed to the sole owners. And this is also consistent with the decline of the crop share, which require a lot more intimate knowledge of agricultural production, where a lot of the landowners may not necessarily know all the production expenses for crop share that they have to share half and half with the tenant as well.
So if you were to give an overall assessment of farmland ownership in Iowa in just a few words, what are we seeing?
I think there are several headlines. One is landowners are aging. So I think that this has implications, especially for the leasing relationship, especially when you're thinking about who your landowner is. Many of the cases, they currently do not farm. And in many cases, they may not have farming experience. And so you need to think about how you communicate with your case. Another perspective I didn't mention is many people would naturally draw the line saying that if we think about the growing number of the land that is owned by senior landowners, we will see an influx of the land coming to the market. We don't necessarily see that because we also have statistics that tell you about the land transfer plans. And the most dominant categories of the methods of landowner planned land transfer plans is they typically want to transfer within the family through will or gift or sale within the family members. Only 4% of Iowa farmland owners we interviewed expressed interest to sell their land to others, so non-family members. And even among those, only 10% of those people express that they are planning to do that within the next 5 years.
And lastly, this was your last survey as you've moved on from Iowa State University to Cornell. Anything you'd like to share about your time at ISU overseeing the Farmland Values Survey and Farmland Ownership Survey?
I really want to thank everyone, including the friends at Iowa Farm Bureau, for the incredible support for my 7-8 years at Iowa State. Iowa is a special place in U.S. agriculture and the global economy. And I had the pleasure to shepherd some of the most unique surveys. And if you think about that, every time we do the Iowa Land Value Survey, Iowa Land Ownership and Tenure Survey, not only people in Iowa would care about this, because the significance of Iowa in U.S. and global agriculture, that we get a lot more interest because Iowa tends to be the trendsetter in agriculture and especially in commodity agriculture. And also, I think that this is because of strong collaboration between the land-grant University, Iowa State, and the legislature, as well as the stakeholders. So the value of the data, as I mentioned today, is not only that we do this one-time survey now, it's the value precisely is because that we started the survey first in the nation and one of its kind in the nation. That the Iowa Land Value Survey was started in the 1940s, and this survey was started in the 40s and more consistently collected since the 1980s. So we not only can provide the information now, but we can look back 40 years and 80 years for the Land Value Survey. That provides a valuable data sets in many states. And I'm happy to report that even though that I left Iowa State to Cornell, that my position at Iowa State has already been filled by one of the fresh PhD graduates from my alma mater, Ohio State University Ag Econ Department, Dr. Rabel Chandio, who will be coming in, and she will be shepherding the Iowa Land Value Survey. And the next 5 years later, the 2027 Iowa Farmland Ownership and Tenure Survey, and she will also be hosting the Soil Management Land Valuation Conference, which is the longest running conference in ISU, actually standing at, I think, 95 years anniversary now. So I think that, agriculture is pretty significant, and I want to thank everyone for helping me do the job I do at Iowa State, and I really enjoyed the time. And Iowa is a special place that will be dear in our heart forever.
Some interesting changes in Iowa's farmland ownership for all of us to consider. Those findings, especially the growing percentage of farmland that's leased, lead to our next conversation with Erin Herbold-Swalwell, who has expertise into farmland lease agreements and the relationships between landlords and tenants. Spokesman editor Tom Block sat down with Erin late last month to pick her brain ahead of a key deadline for farmland rental agreements.
Erin, according to an Iowa State University study, 58% of Iowa's farmland is under a lease, which makes conversations surrounding farmland leases very important. Now, the state of Iowa has a September 1 deadline for terminating lease agreements. Can you explain what that means and what farmers and landlords should be thinking about leading up to that deadline?
Sure, Tom. What I usually think about is we need to make sure that we don't forget that deadline. So it's one of those things, I always have it in my calendar, any members that we can tell about the lease termination deadline we do, because a lot of people think that more applies to landlords terminating. Well, in today's day and age, when we have a lot of fluctuations in the market and fluctuations in cash rent prices, that deadline is really applicable too for tenants. And so I think it's really important. So in Iowa, you have to terminate a farm lease in writing, has to be in writing according to the statute, prior to September 1st. So some people will say, well, I sent it on September 1st. That's not good enough. You've got to terminate it prior to September 1st. So at least have it in the mail, postmarked by the last day of August for that to be a valid termination. And so how that would work would be, a lot of times in practicality, what I would do would be to inform your tenant, call them, or vice versa, inform your landlord. Call them over the phone or write them a short letter saying, look, we would like to renegotiate this year. So Iowa law requires that if we're going to change our lease, we need to terminate that lease prior to September 1. And sometimes that goes a long way with the other party, so they think, okay, they're still open to me farming next year. And I think that can help make sure that your negotiations are clear and that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, you want to have those conversations instead of just sending something to somebody in the mail and surprising them. Make sure you reach out ahead of time.
Yeah, definitely, because one shocking thing is if you have a lease termination delivered by a sheriff, no one likes to see the sheriff come up to their door and give them something that kind of causes a little bit of anxiety. So I think it's all in the way that you do it. Yeah,
and you said it needs to be in writing. Explain to me what the process is or how you can do that in writing. Does it need to be a legal document, or can it just be a short note, written down and mailed, like you said, prior to September 1st?
Yeah. So really, a lease termination notice is pretty straightforward. So there are requirements in the statute, and the lease termination, so you're terminating that lease beginning on March 1st of the next crop year. So in Iowa, farm leases run from March 1 to March 1, which is kind of weird, but that's what the statute says. So if you're terminating, keep in mind that tenant or landlord has the ability to honor that lease until March 1st. So if I were sending out a termination notice, most likely a farmer would go to the Iowa State University website, the Ag Decision Maker website, and there's a form on there for farm lease termination. You could go as far as have your local attorney draft that termination notice up for you, just to make sure you've jumped through all the hoops. But most often what people do is they mail that notice to their tenant. They may hand deliver it. I think the safest way to do it is to mail it, certified mail, and then return receipt requested. I always say that return receipt requested is pretty important, just because of the line of cases that makes some attorneys kind of question how to mail that. So that's probably the safest and most common way that people do a lease termination in Iowa. There are multiple other ways you could do it. You could actually post notice in the newspaper. You could have the sheriff serve it like we talked about. But I think mailing that notice is probably the most common, and sometimes accompanied with a letter saying, let's meet later to talk.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds like good advice. Now, after that termination deadline, September 1st, that's just the notice that you have to give. But what's the process then after that, the normal timeline that most lease negotiations follow?
I think it runs the gamut. I know that a lot of farm lease negotiations happen around the Christmas time, first of the year, possibly even as late as January or February, right, before the beginning of the crop year. I always recommend that you start that negotiation process early on, especially when you know what the input costs are going to be, after harvest. Maybe get through harvest and have those discussions early on. Maybe you don't formalize things or finalize it until the beginning of the year, but I think it's good to start having those conversations after harvest.
Yeah, once the information that you need is in, the yields, and then you start to know what the input costs are going to be. Yeah,
definitely, because as a tenant or as a landlord, that'd be nice to have that information available to know if you're coming up with a fair arrangement for everyone.
Mm-hmm. So what are the different types of lease agreements commonly used in Iowa, such as cash rent, crop share, flexible cash rent? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of each of those?
Yeah. So the most popular, as you'd probably guess, is the cash rent lease. It's very straightforward. You exchange cash rent for however many acres you're farming at whatever rate, right? And so that's the most straightforward and easiest way, I think, to rent out your ground. But, as a farmer or even as a landlord, a lot of people choose to share the risk and enter into some type of crop share agreement where they share the costs and then also the grain at the end of the day. And so there still are a lot of people that will do crop share leases sometimes. And, we always say, make sure you just, if you do nothing else, get your lease in writing. There are still a lot of people out there that will have sort of a handshake agreement. And we can talk more about that. But with a handshake agreement, of course, it's always a he said, she said type of issue. So at the very least, get that in writing, especially with a crop share lease. Make sure everybody understands what the share is. Typically, it's a 50-50 share. I have seen in the last several years that the flexible cash rent lease or flexible share lease has become a lot more popular. And I think it's kind of the best of both worlds, right? The landlord is assured that they're going to get a certain amount of cash for rent. And then if the crop does really well, or you can flex it in certain areas, right? You can flex it on yield, or you can flex it on price, different things. So I think there are forms out there. I know Iowa State University has a really good bank of forms. The Iowa Bar Association has good forms out there to kind of help you get that in writing. I would say the advantages, like we talked about, of cash rent is pretty simple and straightforward, right? As long as that tenant is farming the ground in the way that you've agreed to under the terms of the lease, then they pay you the cash and everybody kind of goes on their way. Crop share can be a little more difficult, but also can be beneficial for the parties. It can be a little more difficult in that the landlord, if they haven't been involved in farming, they may have to kind of learn some things about farming. They may have to market their own grain, all of those types of things. So that's one thing that might be a drawback, but a big advantage, especially for a beginning farmer, is that risk is shared between landlord and tenant. And so I see that a lot with maybe family arrangements, or just when someone wants to get a beginning farmer started. I also see that when you maybe have a retiring farmer that doesn't quite want to get out of the business of farming, but they still kind of want to be involved. They just don't want to contribute that much labor anymore. So I think the flex lease, if you can draft it the right way and you can come to the terms, that's a pretty advantageous type of lease. And I think people are starting to do that. So I think it's all in what you can work out and, not closing your mind to an option, just trying to talk that out with the other person.
And once we've decided what kind of lease we're going to do, such as cash rent or crop share or flexible cash rent, how can farmers and landowners ensure a fair and mutually beneficial lease agreement for both parties?
Yeah, I think, Tom, to make this an easier process, you can start with the forms that are available, the written forms, and maybe go off of other forms of leases that you've used in the past. But I think starting with that and kind of reviewing what the common terms are is really important. I think there's a lot of different things to consider. We probably have a lot of farmers in our state that will use the Iowa State short form rental agreement, right? And that's a good form, but sometimes you might miss some things that you probably should have talked about. And so I just recommend starting with the long form agreement, or there's an Iowa State Bar Association form that is very thorough that they can talk through as well. So there's a lot of different ways you can think of a fair and mutually beneficial lease agreement. And I think there may be some landowners that have heard of high cash rent rates happening right now. And then there's probably tenants or farmers who are thinking, gosh, grain prices are going down. We're in a drought right now. I want to be really careful. And so I think this year will definitely be a time when you really need to sit down and think about how we're going to create a long-lasting relationship and hopefully be a little flexible. And you could also think of some novel ways to provide value rather than cash.
Yeah, I can't tell you how often we get calls from a landowner. We'll print the survey in the Spokesman that says a certain county had a certain cash rent, and they'll want to just go based off that. But there's a lot of other things that need to be considered. And you mentioned that going through that long form, all the different things to talk about. What are some of those factors that farmers and landowners should consider when determining the appropriate rental rate? Yields, costs, conservation, things like that? Just go down the list of some things to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of different things you should look at. So from a farmer standpoint, if you haven't rented that farm before, I would want to ask for access to yields, cost of production, all of those types of things. And I think a landowner should really require that the farmer provide them some information on how the farm is doing, what the yields are, especially if it's a cash rent situation. So having that communication is really important. But I think when you're determining what the rent is, you mentioned the Iowa State University cash rent rate, and we print those. And usually those are the averages in the county, right? So it's a survey, so we have a lot of different people that answer that survey. So it changes every year. Usually it's a pretty reliable source, I think. But if you look a little deeper in that survey, you'll see what are the averages based on CSR or the type of soil and all of those things. So I think if you dig a little bit and you know what your CSR is, you know what your cost of production is, what yields you've been getting, field size and shape, that's also important. And drainage, that's going to be a big difference maker for a lot of farmers. You know, some people have invested that money in drainage and some landowners haven't. So I would look at all of those things.
And I've heard some farmers and landowners, as we get more thinking about the environment and conservation, you can include those kind of things into a farm lease too. If we want to do cover crops and maybe have the landowner share in the cost of applying a cover crop, because that is a long-term benefit that will accumulate over the years.
Yeah. Some landlords are really excited to see a tenant that has the ability to add some value to the farm, especially if that farm is going to be passed down to the next generation, and that next generation is hopefully going to continue to get income off of that farm. And so I see a lot of people adding in maybe a lease addendum where they agree that they're going to put this amount of hours into conservation efforts with their equipment that they have, if they have dozers, if they have that type of conservation equipment. That's one thing that I think can really be a difference maker in getting that cash rental rate down a little bit in this era of pretty high cash rent rates. Even crop share, that would work for that as well. And me just be an extra that would attract a landowner and want them to do business with you. So some of the other things that you could also do would be cover crops, enrolling in any government programs that might be available, or cost share some projects so that landowner and tenant could both be involved in that. I've seen tenants that have worked with their landlords in installing buffers or terraces or bioreactors, those types of things. I've seen a lot of really unique things that help add value to what a farmer is bringing to the landowner.
Yeah, those edge of field practices, like you say, for those buffers and things like that. Mm-hmm. For some landowners, it's not always about the top dollar. It is those extras that a farmer could provide. So from a farmer's perspective, a beginning farmer, any other things non-monetarily that help make this lease agreement go smoother?
Well, I kind of laugh about this, but I remember my great uncle Joe always put a lot of stock into, will the farmer actually mow the ditches? Will they do those things, take care of the weeds? Will they keep up the area around the bin site? Will they do those things that are just a little bit extra and make my place look nice and make me proud of how that looks? I think as a beginning farmer, those are huge things that you can do that are difference makers. Communicating with them, I remember my dad had a landlord that he's since passed away, but he would always come out to the field, and he loved it when my dad invited him to get in the combine and ride with him and kind of tell him about what they were doing. And I think just taking time for the landowner to make sure you kind of educate them on what you're doing and how you're doing it and what technology you're using, I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, that's some great advice there. When we think of leases, we typically think of year to year, but are there some different requirements maybe for a multi-year lease?
So in Iowa, we have a few different rules, and one of those is that if you have a lease that's 5 years or more, that has to be recorded with the county recorder. So it's got to be signed. For that to be effective over 5 years, you've got to do that. So that's one requirement that we have. Sometimes people miss that. So if you have missed it, don't panic. Just make sure that you get that recorded. For under 5 years, a lot of times you want to specify in the lease how many years that is to run. And then typically what happens at the end of a multi-year lease. So for example, if you had a 3-year farm lease, cash rent farm lease, and it's going to expire March 1 of that next crop season, you'll want to make sure that you send a lease termination that September 1st prior to the end of the crop year, just to make sure that you're covering all your bases. And you need to do that Otherwise, the lease would then roll over on a year-to-year basis after that. So always make sure that you're sending that lease termination when you need to be.
Yeah, mark it on a calendar or someplace that you're just going to remember to do that. Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier the handshake agreement. I want to circle back to that. A lot of leases are set up that way where, my handshake is my word, but talk a little bit more. Why is it important to have a written agreement?
Yeah.
And if you don't have a written agreement, are those handshake or verbal agreements still binding?
So the handshake and verbal agreements can be binding if everybody recognizes what the terms are and you've had a good discussion and kind of a meeting of the minds on that, and you could actually prove that to a court that you had a mutual understanding. Sometimes if it's verbal or something just scribbled on a notepad or something like that, that can be a little harder for a court to decipher. So a verbal agreement, you're probably not going to have that language about like a good husbandry clause or clauses about what you do with the crop residue or those types of things. So I think that, yes, a verbal lease, that works. The problem is if you agree to a verbal lease that was 2 years or 3 years, a multi-year lease, that's not going to hold up in a court of law. It only would hold up on a year-to-year basis. So that's kind of a technical, in the law, we call it the statute of frauds, which just means anything over a year has to be in writing. So a contract over a year must be in writing. So think about those things. If you're going to do the multi-year, you for sure need a lease agreement in writing. The year-to-year, I would still recommend obviously having it in writing, but we still have an awful lot of people out there that will do the handshake agreement. I think what people maybe forget is that when the original parties to the agreement are gone, if one of them passes away or goes out of business, then that agreement looks a lot different with somebody new in the picture. So that's something to think about too. Look at it as more of a future issue than right now, and in trusting and knowing that person.
Something else you mentioned earlier, and we'll dive into a little more, is if a lease isn't being renewed, what are the legal obligations regarding use of the property until the next tenant takes possession to begin preparing the field for the following year's crop?
The things that you think you shouldn't have to say, right? I mean, the farmer that is leasing has access to the ground. If they get terminated prior to September 1, they are in full possession of that ground until March 1 of the next crop year. So there could be a different arrangement made, right? So if that farmer knows he's not going to be farming, he or she isn't going to be farming the next year, then they make an arrangement with a landlord in writing to change the terms of that lease, in writing saying, hey, we'll remove ourselves from the property December 1 or after harvest, after the crop is harvested, so your next tenant can get in and start doing some fall work. And so that could work. The thing that I think people need to understand is that if it's not in writing, if a landlord and a tenant don't agree to that in writing after the September 1st change, then it's not effective, right? So anytime during the term of the lease, if landlord and tenant agree on something different and they put that in writing, that lease can be changed. So that's just something, get any changes in writing as well.
But it would affect things, especially, like you say, preparing for the next year, if you want to graze the corn stalks or bale the corn stalks, or if you're talking about a pasture here, that person wouldn't legally have the right to graze it up until March 1st.
Yeah, and there was an interesting case about this a few years ago where the landlord, I think there was an attorney, had sent a notice saying, I'm terminating your lease, and it was done prior to September 1, but they said your lease is terminated effective December 15th. Of that year or something. And so they were essentially kicking the tenant off early so they wouldn't have had that opportunity to graze or fully utilize what they'd paid for. Mm-hmm. And so the courts feel really, really strongly that that's not permissible. If the tenant had agreed to that arrangement with the landlord in writing, that would have been a different story. But just saying, hey, it's terminated and you need to get off of the ground by December 15th isn't enough under the eyes of the law.
Are there any other legal requirements or regulations specific to farmland leasing in Iowa that our listeners should be aware of?
Yeah, there may be some confusion still out there on a couple of things. We had, when I talk about changes to the farm leasing law, they don't come around very often, but a few that we've had in the last 10 or 15 years, which makes me feel old saying that. One of them is there was a change on crop residue. So the tenant has the right to take the residue, stalks, bale it, whatever they need to do, as long as they don't violate the conservation plan. They have the right to do that unless you have agreed in writing that they don't get the right to do that. So that's one change that the legislature made. The other is back in the day, anything under 40 acres you didn't need to terminate by the statutory deadline or by September 1. Now you do, except with you have to terminate every farm lease except for those that involve an animal feeding operation, and there's a lot of different requirements there. But for your crop leases, you need to make sure that they're all terminated. So we don't have that 40-acre requirement anymore.
Sounds like the overarching message is to have it in writing, think of all the scenarios, and put it down so both parties, there's no misunderstandings.
Yes. And I know it's easy to go on your way and say, oh, we've got an agreement and I have more important things to deal with right now, but I think you won't regret it if you get it in writing. Another instance I can think of is what if your tenant passes away, or what if the landlord passes away in the middle of a farm tenancy and you don't have anything in writing. That's one of the risks that you open yourself up to. So I always say when a tenant dies, that lease really dies because it's kind of like a personal services contract. When the landlord dies, that lease continues on because there will be a landowner in place, maybe the executor of an estate for a while or trustee, but there's still a landlord in place.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we all know, farmland rental rates have been on a steady path higher. What are some resources folks can use to stay informed about changes in the market? We mentioned Iowa State does a good survey. Yeah. So some places people can look for that.
So, Iowa State does a really good survey. There's a lot of information on the Ag Decision Maker website that ISU Extension puts up. We have a lot of data in the Spokesman every week. If you take a look at that, I know that keeps everyone really informed on some of the resources that they can use. I would recommend going to some of those seminars that you may not take the time to go to. I know ISU Extension and Farm Bureau, I know we have a lot of resources out there. There's landowner leasing workshops across the state in the summer. So take advantage of attending those things. And I think also just talking with other folks, right? Maybe it's somebody in a different county, but being involved in your local Farm Bureau or wherever you want to be involved as a farmer and try to get that information from others. That's usually how a lot of farmers make decisions.
That's some good advice from Erin. Hopefully you picked up on a thing or two that will help you strengthen your landlord and tenant relationships moving forward. And don't forget those important dates that Erin mentioned, including that September 1st deadline for lease terminations that's coming up in just a few short weeks. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you found it helpful and that you'll join us for the next episode on July 17th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.